On January 6, 1944, at the 8th Air Force Headquarters in High Wycombe, England, Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in Major General William Captain's office, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, when his attention was drawn to something on the wall. Above Captain's desk hung a sign with a straightforward message. The primary duty of 8th Air Force fighters was to bring the bombers back safely. Doolittle read the sign twice, then turned to Captain. "That sign needs to come down," he said quietly. "It is wrong." Within hours, a new sign was displayed. "The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters." This marked a pivotal moment in World War II, shifting the approach to fighter doctrine and ultimately leading to the collapse of the Luftwaffe within weeks. What bomber crews had initially deemed suicidal and some commanders branded reckless would become the strategy that secured air superiority over Europe. It was a decision that would reshape the mathematics of aerial warfare, not only through technological advances, but through one general's bold abandonment of doctrine in favor of results. The crisis had been brewing for months. On October 14, 1943, 291 American B-17 bombers launched a second raid on Schweinfurt, deep in Germany, targeting crucial ball-bearing plants critical to German war production. The Americans reached their target and delivered their bombs with deadly accuracy, but the price was devastating. 60 bombers failed to return, and another 17 were damaged beyond repair. The toll, 600 men dead or missing in a single afternoon. The survival rates for American bomber crews during late 1942 and 1943 were shockingly low, sometimes as low as 25 to 35%. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, recorded in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The forts protect themselves well, but it's not enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." The German fighters had developed deadly tactics. They would stay beyond the range of Allied escort fighters, then strike in mass formations. Attacks at closing speeds of over 600 mph gave American gunners only seconds to react. German fighters armed with 30mm cannons and air-to-air rockets could bring down a B-17 with a single shot. The issue was simple. American escorts like the P-38s and P-47 Thunderbolts lacked the range to accompany bombers to distant targets. Over Schweinfurt, the escorts had to turn back just 300 miles from the target. The bombers pressed on alone, fighting for their lives against German fighters that could strike without fear of reprisal. In December 1943, General Henry Arnold, the commanding officer of the U.S. Army Air Forces, issued a stark ultimatum. Unless the German Air Force was destroyed, the planned invasion of Normandy, known as Operation Overlord, could not proceed. American bombers could not endure such losses any longer. A solution was imperative, or the strategic bombing campaign would cease. The answer came in the form of the sleek, silver P-51 Mustang in November 1943, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine generating 1,695 horsepower. The Mustang possessed capabilities that seemed almost miraculous. Equipped with drop tanks, it could escort bombers up to 1,600 miles into Germany and back. It cruised at 437 mph, faster than any German fighter, and could reach altitudes of 41,000 feet, an area where German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs struggled. Captain Chuck Jerger, a P-51 pilot with the 357th Fighter Group, remarked in his combat report, "The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have an aircraft that can go anywhere the bombers go and fight when we get there. This changes everything, but having the range to escort bombers was only part of the solution. The tactical deployment of these escorts would be crucial to success. Under the old doctrine, fighters flew in tight formation around the bombers, staying within visual range at all times. If German fighters attacked, the escorts would engage, but only long enough to drive the attackers off before returning to close formation. The priority was always defensive protection. This defensive posture created a fatal flaw. German pilots could choose when and where to attack. They would mass beyond visual range, dive through the bomber formations at maximum speed, inflict casualties, and then escape before American fighters could launch an effective counterattack. The escorts were reacting to the German initiative, not seizing it. Major General Ira Ecker, the outgoing commander of the 8th Air Force, had institutionalized this defensive strategy. Ecker, a former bomber pilot himself, believed that bombers could protect themselves with interlocking fields of fire from their machine guns. Fighters were meant to supplement, not replace, this defense. Jimmy Doolittle, however, saw the situation differently. Unlike most, Doolittle was not a bomber pilot but a fighter commander. His decision would change the course of the war. Doolittle was not just a bomber commander, but also a fighter pilot, test pilot, and racing champion. Holding a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT, he had a deep understanding of aircraft performance and tactical dynamics that few others could match. His reputation had been solidified by the daring April 18, 1942 raid on Tokyo, where he led 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet. The mission was technically challenging and audacious, and Doolittle received the Medal of Honor for leading it. Now he was in command of the 8th Air Force with a clear mandate from General Arnold to resolve the fighter protection problem. On January 6, 1944, Doolittle's first full day in command, he met with General Kieptner and issued a groundbreaking order. Fighters were no longer to stay close to bombers for defensive protection. Instead, they would move ahead of the bomber stream, flying up to 50 miles ahead and 25 miles to either side, actively hunting for German fighters. After the bombers had completed their missions and turned for home, the American fighters would not return with them. Instead, they would sweep across Germany, strafing airfields, destroying aircraft on the ground, and attacking trains and fuel depots. The goal was not just to protect the bombers, but to obliterate the Luftwaffe entirely. The order shocked American fighter pilots and terrified bomber crews. Colonel Donald Blakesley, commander of the legendary 4th Fighter Group, immediately understood the significance. "This is what we've been asking for," he told his pilots. "We are no longer shepherds guarding sheep. We are wolves." But Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, operations officer of the 354th Fighter Group, captured the bomber crew's fear. They feared that the fighters abandoning them to hunt German aircraft elsewhere would leave them defenseless. They did not yet understand that eliminating German fighters before they could reach the bombers would be a far better defense than waiting to shoot them down after the attack. The bomber crew's concerns were not unfounded. They had survived countless missions only because fighters stayed close, fending off enemy attackers. Now, with the fighters disappearing over the horizon, the bombers appeared to be left alone, vulnerable to the German threat. Many bomber crews believed Doolittle's new order would be their death sentence. A reckless move by a general who did not understand their war. Whether Doolittle's gamble would succeed or fail depended on how the Luftwaffe responded to the new American tactics. By the winter of 1943-44, the Luftwaffe believed victory was within their grasp. Despite 3 years of relentless Allied bombing, German fighter production was on the rise. Factories in Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf were producing over 1,000 fighters each month. German pilots had developed effective tactics, with the heavily armed Sturmbock Focke-Wulf 190 fighters equipped with heavy cannons capable of destroying bombers with a single attack run. These were escorted by faster Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, whose job was to tie up the American escorts, allowing the Sturmbocks to wreak havoc on the bombers. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of the German fighter forces, believed the Luftwaffe was winning the attrition battle. In November 1943, he reported to Reich Marshal Hermann Göring that American bomber losses were unsustainable. If we maintain this pressure, Galland wrote, the Americans will be forced to abandon daylight bombing by spring. However, Galland's analysis failed to account for one critical factor: pilot attrition. While Germany was producing fighters at a rapid pace, they could not replace their experienced pilots at the same rate. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 3,000 fighter pilots, killed, wounded, or missing. To meet the demand, training time for new pilots was slashed from 250 hours to 150 hours, meaning that many new pilots entered combat with insufficient skills. These inexperienced pilots were quickly outclassed by seasoned American aviators. One German pilot, Feldwebel Hans Dammers, described the problem in a letter to his brother in January 1944. The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they are killed. They do not know how to dogfight, cannot coordinate with their wingmen, and freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while fighting the Americans. It's becoming impossible. The winter storms of early 1944 delayed the testing of Doolittle's new tactics, grounding bombers for days. But on January 29th, over 800 bombers launched against Frankfurt, and the new fighter tactics were put to the test. P-51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group soared ahead of the bomber stream at 28,000 feet, flying in loose formations that maximize visibility and reaction time. These escorts were not tied to specific bomber boxes. Instead, they hunted for German fighters wherever they might appear. Near Bonn, the Mustangs spotted a formation of 50 Messerschmitt Bf-109s climbing to intercept the bombers. Instead of waiting for the Germans to attack, the Mustangs dove on them. The Germans, expecting to attack the bombers at their leisure, were caught off guard and forced to fight for their lives against fighters with superior speed and altitude. The engagement lasted only 8 minutes. 13 German fighters were shot down, while 2 Mustangs were damaged, but both returned to base. This marked the first real success of Doolittle's new tactics and set the stage for the eventual destruction of the Luftwaffe. The remaining German formations scattered and failed to reach the bombers. Captain Don Blakesley, leading the 4th Fighter Group on a similar mission that day, recalled the effect of the new tactics. "We caught 20 Focke-Wulfs forming up over Cologne. They were slow, heavily loaded with ammunition and fuel, climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before the rest could escape. This is how you win a war." The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day noticed a remarkable difference. German fighter attacks, which usually began far from the target and persisted throughout the bomb run, were barely noticeable. A few isolated attacks occurred, but the mass formations that had devastated previous raids were absent. The new fighter tactics had intercepted them first, but the true test of Doolittle's strategy came in February 1944. With Operation Argument, soon known as Big Week, General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, designed the operation as bait. American bombers would strike German aircraft factories so critical that the Luftwaffe would be forced to defend them with everything they had. The objective wasn't solely to destroy the factories, though that would be a bonus. The goal was to force the Luftwaffe into a decisive battle of attrition against American fighters that now outnumbered, outperformed and outclassed their German counterparts. On February 20th, 1944, clear skies over Germany provided the perfect conditions. Over 1,000 American bombers from England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters, launched attacks on 12 different aircraft production facilities. It was the largest single-day air armada in history. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's leading ace with 352 victories, watched the American formation pass overhead and instantly understood what was happening. "This is not a bombing raid," he told his squadron. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse. They want us to come up and fight, and we have no choice." The Luftwaffe responded with everything they had. Over 900 German fighters scrambled to intercept the American formations. The sky above central Germany erupted into the largest air battle in history. Contrails from thousands of aircraft crossed at altitudes ranging from sea level to 40,000 feet. But this time, American fighters were not bound to the bombers for defensive protection. Instead, they ranged across hundreds of miles of German airspace, hunting German fighters wherever they were found, on the ground, taking off, forming up, or approaching the bombers. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted relentlessly. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me-262 jets, Germany's revolutionary new fighter, taking off from an airfield near Leipzig. While the jets were fast and deadly once airborne, they were vulnerable during takeoff. Drew dove from 30,000 feet, dodging flak, and opened fire on the lead jet as it lifted off the runway. The jet exploded, and he destroyed a second one before it could gain speed. The other jets scattered. Drew's combat report became legendary. The jets are dangerous in the air, but they must take off and land like any aircraft. Catch them there and they burn like any other. The first day of Big Week cost the Americans 21 bombers and 4 fighters. By the standards of Schweinfurt 3 months earlier, this was a miracle. But German losses were catastrophic, over 50 fighters destroyed, and more critically, 38 pilots killed or seriously wounded. For the next 5 days, whenever the weather allowed, the attacks continued. American bombers struck targets like Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt again, Gotha and Augsburg. Each raid brought hundreds of bombers and fighters. Each raid forced the Luftwaffe to respond. And each raid cost Germany fighters and pilots it could not replace. Major Heinz Baer, a German ace with over 220 victories, described the impossible situation in his diary. "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up, and they attack us before we can attack. We land to refuel, and they strafe the airfield. We take off, and they're waiting. There is no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and pilots." By February 25th, when Big Week concluded, the statistics told the story. American losses included 226 heavy bombers, 28 escort fighters, and approximately 2,600 casualties. While these were serious losses, American production and training replaced them within a month. German losses, however, were devastating. Over 350 fighters were destroyed, and another 90 were damaged beyond repair. Even worse, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 pilots killed and over 50 seriously wounded. These pilots had an average of more than 3 years of combat experience. They were irreplaceable. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ellerfeld, commander of a Jagdgeschwader fighter wing, wrote in his report to Galland, "We are losing the most experienced men. The new pilots cannot survive against the American fighters. Within 3 months, we will have aircraft, but no one capable of flying them in combat." Doolittle's strategy extended beyond aerial combat. The second phase of his directive, strafing attacks on German airfields and infrastructure, proved equally destructive. Every day, as American fighters returned from escort missions, they would drop to low altitudes and attack targets of opportunity across Germany. Airfields suffered particularly heavy damage. Fighters parked in the open, aircraft under maintenance, fuel trucks and hangars all became prime targets. German pilots returned from combat missions to find their airfields crippled and their ability to conduct further operations severely hampered. Their home airfields were under attack, forcing German pilots to divert to alternate bases or land amid strafing runs. Major Gunther R., a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, described the psychological toll. "We used to feel safe on our own airfields. Nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and night. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics are killed while servicing aircraft. Fuel trucks explode. We cannot maintain operations under constant attack." The cumulative effect began to show by March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin itself. On March 6th, 730 bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, attacked the German capital. Given the symbolic and strategic importance of Berlin, the Luftwaffe was forced to respond with maximum effort. They did. Over 150 German fighters engaged the American formations, and the resulting battle stretched across hundreds of miles as fighters clashed while bombers pressed on toward their targets. When the battle ended, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans, however, lost 160 aircraft and had another 50 damaged. The pilot casualties were staggering. Nearly 70 experienced German fighter pilots were killed or wounded in a single day. For the Luftwaffe, it was a disaster from which recovery was impossible. Captain Johannes Wieser, group commander of the 1st Group of Jagdgeschwader 52, survived the March 6th battle and wrote that evening, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We threw everything against them and it was not enough. They shot us down faster than we could shoot them down. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent. The war is lost." Between January and May 1944, the cumulative attrition proved unsustainable for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, nearly 1/4 of the pilots available at the start of the period. More critically, the losses hit hardest among the most experienced pilots. The veterans, those with dozens or even hundreds of victories, the squadron and group commanders and the instructors, were systematically killed. These were the pilots who led from the front, who were the most aggressive in combat and tried to protect the new, inexperienced recruits. Between January and May, 28 German aces with over 30 kills were killed, and 8 aces with over 100 kills were killed or captured. Each of these men represented years of training and combat experience. They were irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not keep pace with the attrition. In 1944, Germany graduated 29,000 new fighter pilots, but training time had dropped to just 110 total hours of flight time by mid-year, with some late-war pilots receiving as few as 50 hours. In contrast, American pilots in the same period received over 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in their combat aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, expressed the situation in his final letter home before being killed in action in October 1943. The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly formation properly. They don't understand tactical principles. They panic under fire. In combat with experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, they survive 1, maybe 2 missions, then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time. The disparity in aircraft production was another critical factor. In the first 6 months of 1944, American factories produced over 22,000 fighter aircraft. German factories, despite efforts to disperse production to avoid Allied bombing, produced only 9,000 fighters. The sheer numerical advantage was overwhelming, but the qualitative difference between the two forces made the disparity decisive. The P-51 Mustang was simply superior to the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 in most combat scenarios. It was faster, had better range, superior high-altitude performance, and equal or better maneuverability. Colonel Hubert Ziska, commander of the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, noted the combined effect. "We have more fighters, better trained pilots, better tactics, and unlimited fuel and ammunition. The Germans have brave men flying good aircraft they cannot keep supplied or properly maintained. Courage cannot overcome such a disadvantage forever." By April 1944, the transformation in the air war was complete. German fighter strength, measured in operational aircraft and pilots, had fallen to less than 60% of its January levels. More importantly, the quality of the force had suffered catastrophic declines. The veteran formations that had decimated bomber raids in October 1943 no longer existed. The new Luftwaffe consisted mostly of inexperienced pilots flying aircraft with insufficient fuel, inadequate ammunition, and minimal maintenance. They faced American formations that grew larger and more confident with each mission. On May 8, 1944, The 8th Air Force dispatched nearly 900 bombers to attack oil refineries and marshalling yards across Germany, escorted by over 750 fighters. Not a single German fighter rose to intercept. For the first time, the Luftwaffe conceded the skies without a fight. General Galland reported to Goering that day, "The fighter force is destroyed. We have aircraft but cannot fly them for lack of fuel. We have pilots, but most cannot fight effectively. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest their air superiority." The strategic impact of this was made clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on the first day of the invasion. Luftwaffe fighters flew fewer than 300 sorties. The disparity in air support allowed Allied ground forces to press forward with minimal interference from German air forces. The Luftwaffe was no longer a viable threat to the success of the invasion or the continued Allied air campaign. Their home airfields were under constant attack, forcing German pilots to divert to alternate bases or land amidst strafing runs. Major Gunther R., a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, explained the psychological toll. "We used to feel safe on our airfields. Now nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and night. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics are killed while servicing aircraft. Fuel trucks explode. We can no longer maintain operations under continuous attack." The cumulative effect became evident by March 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin itself. On March 6th, 730 bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, attacked the German capital. Due to Berlin's symbolic and strategic importance, the Luftwaffe had no choice but to respond with everything they had. They did. Over 150 German fighters engaged the American formations, and the ensuing battle spanned hundreds of miles as fighters clashed while bombers pressed toward their targets. When the battle ended, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans, however, lost 160 aircraft and had another 50 damaged. The pilot casualties were staggering. Nearly 70 experienced German fighter pilots were killed or wounded in just one day. For the Luftwaffe, it was a disaster from which recovery was impossible. Captain Johannes Wiese, group commander of the first group of Jagdgeschwader 52, survived the March 6th battle and wrote that evening, "Today I watched the German fighter arm die. We threw everything at them, and it was not enough. They shot us down faster than we could shoot them down. Their losses are temporary, ours are permanent. The war is lost." Between January and May 1944, the attrition proved unmanageable for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilot losses exceeded 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, representing nearly a quarter of their available pilots at the start of the period. More critically, the most experienced pilots were the hardest hit. The veterans, those with dozens or even hundreds of victories, the squadron and group commanders, and the instructors were systematically eliminated. These were the pilots who led from the front, who were the most aggressive in combat and tried to protect the new, inexperienced recruits. Between January and May, 28 German aces with over 30 kills were killed, and 8 aces with over 100 kills were either killed or captured. Each of these men represented years of training and combat experience. They were irreplaceable. The training pipeline could not keep pace with the attrition. In 1944, Germany graduated 29,000 new fighter pilots, but their training time had been cut to just 110 total hours of flight time by mid-year, with some pilots receiving as few as 50 hours. In contrast, American pilots received over 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in their combat aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, expressed the situation in his final letter home before being killed in action in October 1943. "The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly formation properly. They don't understand tactical principles. They panic under fire. In combat with experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft, they survive one, maybe two missions, then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time. The disparity in aircraft production played a significant role as well. In the first half of 1944, American factories produced over 22,000 fighter aircraft, while Germany, despite dispersal efforts to avoid Allied bombing, produced only 9,000. The numerical advantage was overwhelming, but the qualitative difference made the disparity decisive. The P-51 Mustang was simply superior to the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 in most combat situations. It was faster, had better range, superior high-altitude performance, and equal or better maneuverability. Colonel Hubert Zga, commanding the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, summarized the effect. We have more fighters, better trained pilots, better tactics, and unlimited fuel and ammunition. The Germans have brave men flying good aircraft they cannot keep supplied or properly maintained. Courage cannot overcome such a disadvantage forever. By April 1944, the transformation in the air war was complete. German fighter strength, measured in operational aircraft and pilots, had dropped to less than 60% of its January levels. More importantly, the quality of the force had suffered catastrophic declines. The veteran formations that had decimated bomber raids in October 1943 were gone. The new Luftwaffe was largely composed of inexperienced pilots, flying aircraft with insufficient fuel, inadequate ammunition, and minimal maintenance. They faced American formations that grew larger and more confident with each mission. By May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent nearly 900 bombers to attack oil refineries and marshalling yards across Germany, escorted by over 750 fighters. Not a single German fighter rose to intercept. For the first time, the Luftwaffe conceded the skies without a fight. General Galland reported to Goering that day, "The fighter force is destroyed. We have aircraft but cannot fly them for lack of fuel. We have pilots, but most cannot fight effectively. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest their air superiority." The strategic impact was made even clearer on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on the first day of the invasion. Luftwaffe fighters flew fewer than 300 sorties. The disparity in air support allowed Allied ground forces to advance with minimal interference from German air forces. The Luftwaffe was no longer a credible threat to the success of the invasion or the continued Allied air campaign. By 1944, modern jets and advanced aircraft were available to the Germans, but they had no experienced pilots left to fly them. The Americans had killed all the good pilots in the spring, one German officer wrote. The war was already lost by the time our production peaked. The success of Doolittle's strategy created a template for modern air warfare that remains relevant today. Air superiority cannot be achieved defensively. It demands aggressive offensive action against enemy aircraft and infrastructure. Technological advantage matters, but the quality of training matters more. Numerical superiority is decisive only when combined with qualitative superiority. Perhaps most crucially, leadership willing to challenge conventional doctrine and accept risk can yield strategic results far beyond incremental improvements to existing methods. Doolittle's decision to change the sign on Kieptena's wall was more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental shift in how fighters should be used. Initially, bomber crews feared Doolittle's tactics, considering them abandonment. However, they soon came to understand and appreciate the strategy. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a reporter for Stars and Stripes who flew bombing missions to cover the air war, wrote in June 1944, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." This paradox was true. When the fighters flew close to bombers, the Germans attacked anyway. When they flew ahead and hunted, the Germans couldn't reach us. The best defense was a good offense. General Doolittle understood this. We did not. He was right. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied air forces had achieved complete air superiority over Western Europe. German aircraft still operated, but in such small numbers and with such limited effectiveness that they could no longer contest Allied air operations. The success of the invasion was, in part, because soldiers could fight without the fear of enemy air attacks. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, acknowledged this in his post-invasion assessment. The air forces gave us the one thing essential for success. They gave us freedom to operate without enemy air interference. General Doolittle's fighter tactics destroyed the Luftwaffe when it was critical to do so. History will judge this as one of the decisive campaigns of the war. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 stands as one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In October, the Luftwaffe seemed to be winning the battle of attrition over Germany. American bomber losses were unsustainable, and the strategic bombing campaign seemed doomed. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was shattered. American bombers flew with minimal losses, and Allied ground forces prepared to invade France under complete air cover. The change was so rapid and complete that German commanders struggled to understand what had happened. General Galland, in his post-war memoirs, identified the turning point with clarity. When the Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war. We could fight American bombers. We could not fight their fighters and their bombers simultaneously. Once they freed the fighters to hunt us, we were doomed. The end was simply a matter of time. The final statistics of the campaign reflect its overwhelming success. Between January and December 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action over the Reich. American and British fighters destroyed over 11,000 German fighters, both in air combat and on the ground. German fighter pilot training time dropped from 200 hours in 1943 to less than 100 hours by late 1944. American losses in the same period totaled approximately 750 fighter pilots and 16,000 bomber crew casualties. These were significant losses, but American training schools graduated over 35,000 new pilots in 1944, and American factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratio in air combat shifted decisively. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters had achieved approximately 1.2 kills for every loss. By 1944, the ratio reversed, with American fighters achieving 3.7 kills for every loss. By 1945, the ratio exceeded 7.1. Perhaps the most telling statistic was pilot experience levels. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 200 hours of combat experience. By January 1945, the average dropped to under 50 hours. The Luftwaffe had not run out of aircraft or fuel. Though both were scarce, it had run out of trained pilots capable of effective combat. Doolittle's controversial decision had achieved precisely what General Arnold demanded. It destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force before the Normandy invasion. It proved that aggressive offensive fighter tactics were more effective than defensive escort tactics. It demonstrated that winning air superiority required destroying enemy fighters, not merely protecting friendly bombers. The human cost was high. Over 26,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe during World War II. More fatalities than the entire United States Marine Corps suffered in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties. These men achieved air superiority through courage, skill, and sacrifice. For the German fighter pilots, the campaign was catastrophic. Thousands of young men, many still teenagers, climbed into aircraft each day, knowing that many would not return. They climbed into their cockpits, knowing survival was unlikely. They fought with courage and skill against overwhelming odds until death claimed them. The aces, veterans, and squadron leaders nearly all died in combat or were captured. Few survived the war. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's leading ace with 352 victories, survived only because he fought primarily on the Eastern Front. After the war, he acknowledged what had happened in the West. The Americans destroyed the Luftwaffe over Germany in 1944. They had better aircraft, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought bravely, but we were overwhelmed. General Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. In January 1944, when Doolittle ordered the sign changed in Captain's office, many thought it was madness. By June, it was recognized as genius. The first duty of fighters was indeed to destroy enemy fighters, and everything else followed from that principle. The Berlin raids, the destruction of German infrastructure, and the protection of ground forces during the invasion were all made possible because American fighters had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe in just 4 months of intense combat. What had seemed reckless proved to be the only path to victory. 70 years later, military historians analyzing the air campaign over Europe consistently identified Doolittle's January directive as the turning point. One decision, one change in tactics, and one general's willingness to challenge doctrine transformed the air war completely. The bombers returned safely, not because fighters stayed close to them, but because fighters destroyed German fighters before they could attack. The counterintuitive truth that offensive action provides better protection than a defensive posture became doctrine. Air forces worldwide learned this lesson. Control of the air comes from destroying enemy aircraft aggressively, not from defending friendly aircraft reactively. Lieutenant General James Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946 after commanding the 8th, 15th and 12th Air Forces during the war. He received numerous decorations, including the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and honorary knighthood from Britain. But of all his achievements, he considered the fighter directive his most significant decision. In a 1970s interview, Doolittle reflected on that January day. Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest decision I made. Bomber commanders opposed it. Bomber crews feared it. Some fighter pilots thought it was suicide. But I knew from my experience as a fighter pilot that offensive action wins air battles. You cannot win by defending. You win by attacking. The losses were terrible, but they would have been worse under defensive tactics. We won because we accepted risk and attacked aggressively, the sign that Doolittle ordered, removed from Captain's wall in January 1944, now resides in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Next to it hangs the replacement sign. Together, they tell the story of a tactical revolution that won air supremacy in Europe. For bomber crews who survived the war, many credited Doolittle's decision with their survival. Initially, they had opposed the change, believing that fighters leaving them to hunt Germans elsewhere was abandonment. Experience taught them otherwise. The best way to protect bombers was to destroy enemy fighters before they could attack. For the Luftwaffe, Doolittle's directive was the beginning of the end. In October 1943, they had been winning the air war of attrition. 6 months later, they were destroyed as an effective force. The combination of American numerical superiority, technological advantage, quality training, and aggressive tactics proved overwhelming. The campaign from January to June 1944 demonstrated military principles that remain valid today. Offensive action defeats defensive action when both sides are roughly equal in capability. Superior training produces superior results, even when outnumbered. Technological advantage combined with tactical innovation creates decisive superiority. Leadership willing to challenge doctrine and accept risk achieves strategic results. But most importantly, winning air superiority requires destroying enemy fighters, not protecting friendly aircraft. This counterintuitive truth, understood by Doolittle and proven in combat over Germany in 1944, remains the foundation of air combat doctrine worldwide. The story of how one general's order to change a sign on a wall led to the destruction of the Luftwaffe in weeks is ultimately a story about understanding the fundamental nature of air combat. Doolittle understood that fighters are offensive weapons, and their primary purpose is killing enemy fighters. Using them defensively wasted their potential and surrendered initiative to the enemy. The bomber crews, who initially feared his tactics, came to understand their wisdom. The German pilots who opposed those tactics learned their effectiveness too late. And military aviation learned lessons that would shape air warfare for generations. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy under clear skies free of German aircraft, the success of Doolittle's strategy was complete. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, destroyed air forces from Poland to France, and bombed London into rubble, was nowhere to be seen. American and British fighters had hunted them to extinction. A single tactical decision, a single change in doctrine, and a single general's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom had achieved what years of bombing could not. The Luftwaffe was destroyed, not by attacking factories, but by attacking fighters. Not by defending bombers, but by hunting aggressively. Not by playing defense, but by seizing the offensive. The sign came down on January 6, 1944. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was finished. The connection between those two events is direct, measurable, and undeniable. One general's reckless strategy had destroyed the enemy air force in weeks, won air supremacy over Europe, and ensured the success of the invasion that would liberate the continent. History would judge Jimmy Doolittle's decision to change fighter tactics as one of the most consequential command decisions of World War II. Not because it was complex or technically sophisticated, but because it was fundamentally correct. The first duty of fighters is to destroy enemy fighters.